Hello there, music lovers. Welcome to the channel. Thanks so much for stopping by and subscribing and commenting and doing all that you do. I really appreciate it. Maybe you've heard the news, but the Eagles have taken over the top spot. The #1 selling album of all time here in the States is their greatest hits album. Just took out Michael Jackson's Thriller. Now, just a little bit of an asterisk here. The Eagles' greatest hits album used to be the #1 selling album for over a decade until Michael Jackson passed away. And then, of course, once he did that, then there was a renewed interest in Michael Jackson. The Thriller album started flying off the shelves, and it overtook the Eagles. But then the Eagles, they one-upped them. Glenn Frey passes away. Renewed interest in the Eagles. They go out on the road when it looked like maybe they had broken up and they were never going to go out again. And so now the Eagles' greatest hits album is #1. And some people don't really like this a whole lot. They say, well, the greatest hits album, that shouldn't be counted. It's a compilation album. Look, an album's an album. What is an album? It's a compilation of songs. Doesn't matter if they were all done in the studio at once or if they were done over a period of time. You know, it's a hot-selling collection of songs, and that's basically what the list is. It doesn't matter what kind of album it is. But if you want to get technical about it, you know, yeah, Thriller is the #1 selling studio album of all time, whereas the Eagles' greatest hits is going to be the top-selling greatest hits album of all time. And actually, you know, when you take a look at the top 10 list, which I'm going to do here, I figured it'd be fun to kind of go through the rest of the top 10 to see what the other big sellers are. It answers a lot of other questions like, you know, what's the biggest selling album of the 70s? You know, what's the biggest selling album of the 90s? You know, what's the biggest selling live album? What's the biggest selling double studio album? All that gets answered here in the top 10 list. Okay, so we already know what the top selling greatest hits album is. The biggest selling studio album of the 80s is Thriller. Thriller is like a greatest hits album by itself. You know, it's got Beat It and Billie Jean and Wanna Be Starting Something, PYT, Human Nature. I mean, that's just scratching the surface. Of course, there's a title track, Thriller is on there. It's a great, great album. And #3 on the list, for you guys who don't think the Eagles really have it, it's Hotel California. So there you go. There's some more Eagles for you. That is a studio album, and that is like a greatest hits album. As a matter of fact, the Eagles' second greatest hits album is practically made up of Hotel California and The Long Run, the album that came after this, selling 26 million copies. #4 is going to be Billy Joel's greatest hits collection, Greatest Hits Volume 1 and 2. Now, I recently did a video about Billy Joel. I'll put a video link up for that. Billy is one of these guys, I think, that he's got a lot of great, great stuff that was never on the radio, a lot of deep cuts. But if you want the hits, the Greatest Hits Volume 1 and 2 is where it's at. It covers most of his career. It doesn't have like his last 3 albums. It doesn't cover anything from The Bridge, Stormfront, or The River of Dreams. I think those are like his weakest albums. I mean, there are some good songs on there, but I think that the greatest hits collection here covers his sweet spot, like his real classic period. All right, so the 5th biggest selling album of all time would also have to be the biggest selling hard rock album of all time, and that would be Led Zeppelin 4, which, you know, like Hotel California and Thriller, is like a greatest hits album in and of itself. I mean, look, it's got rock and roll, it's got Black Dog, it's got Going to California, oh yeah, Stairway to Heaven, When the Levee Breaks, Four Sticks, Misty Mountain Hop. It's a great, great album. And, you know, that being a hard rock album, you know, that probably would have to be the biggest hard rock album of all time. Then after that, we get #6 on the list, Pink Floyd, The Wall, which a lot of people would probably think, oh, wow, I would have thought that Dark Side of the Moon would have been here. Dark Side of the Moon was on the charts probably for the longest of any of these. It started off in the 70s, and it stayed on the charts, you know, for a long, long time in the top 200 albums. I remember deep into the 80s, it still hadn't dropped out of the Billboard charts. So it's got some record there going for it. But in terms of sales, The Wall, which is a double album, has gotten like 23 million in sales. So The Wall would have to have the distinction of being the you know, biggest selling double studio album of all time. And I always did love The Wall. You know, I always loved the way that Roger Waters did it live, especially on the last tour that he did. I caught that show in Nashville, and it was one of my favorite shows that I've ever seen. It was mind-blowing, the visuals that he had going on. And it's a very heartfelt thing, too. You know, Roger Waters lost not only his own father, but his grandfather to war. So he's got maybe a little bit of an axe to grind here. And I think The Wall is still even relevant more now today than it was back in 1980. And if you can catch the movie that he put out recently, which documents his last tour of the Wall, definitely check that out. It's really, really, really good. All right, so the 7th biggest selling album of all time is AC/DC, Back in Black. Again, this is another album that might be like a greatest hits. It's just amazing. You know, it's got, of course, the title track, Back in Black. It's got Hell's Bells, You Shook Me All Night Long, Shoot to Thrill, Break a Leg, Have a Drink on Me. It's just an amazing album. You had Robert Mutt Lange doing the production. Of course, he went on to do like Def Leppard and The Cars and all that stuff. But also, this was the first album with Brian Johnson. He was taking over for Bon Scott, who had died not too long before this. And kind of like with Van Halen, you got a singer that comes in, takes the band into a whole nother direction, and has amazing success. And I think he even did it a little bit better than what Van Halen did. You know, Sammy Hagar didn't go back and do a lot of the David Lee Roth stuff, maybe a couple of songs here and there. Brian Johnson was able to do the Bon Scott stuff, and he did it very, very well, in addition to taking them into the future. So I think that AC/DC achieved tremendous results with him coming on. And from what I understand, they're back in the studio with Brian Johnson and Phil Rudd. There's been some photos taken of Johnson and Rudd outside of a studio. Of course, they have now since put like an umbrella or something over the studio door where they would hang out and smoke and everything, because the word was starting to get out. But there's been no official word, but it looks like AC/DC is going to be back. So when I hear some more about that, I'll let you know. All right, so the 8th biggest selling album of all time is a live album, and it is a double live album, and it's by a country artist, Garth Brooks. What do you think of Garth? You know, I'm not really a Garth Brooks fan. I'm not a country music fan, but I do respect Garth. I think he's achieved tremendous success, and he's done it on his own terms. Kind of reminds me of like, he's kind of like the Billy Joel of country, you know. This album has got it all for you. It's got like the Thunder Rolls and, you know, Friends in Low Places. He even has the cover of Billy Joel's Shameless is on here too. And it's kind of amazing. You know, you would have thought that maybe Frampton Comes Alive, or I don't know, what are some of the other classic live albums of our time. But no, it's Garth Brooks, you know. So that's pretty interesting that he has the #1 live album. Also at number 9 is Hootie and the Blowfish with Cracked Rear View. That would have to mean that Hootie and the Blowfish have the #1 album from the 90s, #1 studio album from the 90s. And I remember when this album came out, I was in radio, and I just getting calls one after another for Hootie, and I was so sick of them. I didn't really care for them a whole lot, really, anyway. But everybody and their brother calling in for them, I don't know. They kind of reminded me of like the Huey Lewis and the News of the 90s or something. You know, you could have called them like Huey and the Blowfish. But, you know what I really like, though? I think that Darius Rucker is a great singer. And he made the transition from pop music to country. He's now a country artist, and he's doing very, very well there, so I got to give him props for that. And the 10th biggest selling album of all time is by Fleetwood Mac and Rumors. And of course, just like Back in Black and Led Zeppelin 4 and Hotel California and Thriller, it is a greatest hits album practically. It's got, you know, Go Your Own Way, and Dreams is on there, Gold Dust Woman, Secondhand News, and many others. It's a great, great album. It was born out of the strife and struggles of 2 marriages breaking up, Christine McVie and John McVie, and of course Buckingham and Nix. And often that's where a lot of the best music comes from. It comes from doing a lot of drugs or breaking up. I mean, let's just face it, that's where a lot of it comes from. That's maybe one of the reasons why we don't have a lot of good music nowadays. It's because everybody's rich and happy. I don't know. What do you think? Anyway, Fleetwood Mac, Of course, I did a couple of videos on them. They are getting ready to hit the road here soon without Lindsey Buckingham. They let him go, which you've probably heard. He's about to go on a solo tour. He has a solo anthology coming up. But Fleetwood Mac now has Neil Finn from Split Enz and Crowded House, and also Mike Campbell from the Heartbreakers on board. Interested to see what they come up with. But that's your top 10 list, folks. It answers, like I said, a lot of questions as to, you know, what the biggest selling albums of the 70s and the 80s and 90s are. And I'd like to know, which of these albums do you have? What do you think about this list? Give this video a thumbs up. If you like it, be sure to hit subscribe too. And I will talk to you later.